Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Second Party Podcast. I had kind of an interesting experience while volunteering at a church recently. And I should preface this with the fact that I'm not really a stickler for rules. I know sometimes people tend to follow all of the rules out there. They're very vehemently opposed to the breaking of any rule.
Like me, am I a rule follower?
A little bit more than me, but not nearly as much as, say, your father. He's very much a rule follower.
I've definitely gotten jaded in the past. Since we've been together.
Yeah, since we've been dating.
Yeah, I am definitely one of those. I always was like goody two shoes, like following all the rules in school, never get in trouble.
Well, I mean, I think there's a big difference between, like, some rules make sense, okay? There's an obvious reason for that rule to be in place.
Some rules, it's like your moral duty to disobey them. For example, having a front license plate, if your state requires it.
Exactly.
It's your duty as a human to disobey that law.
I completely agree. Well, it's state dependent, but yeah, where we are in the surrounding areas, yeah. Don't desecrate the absolute beauty that is the front end design of your vehicle. People painstakingly labored over that design. Yeah. And that's a perfect example of, like that rule should be disobeyed or bent, if you want to characterize it in that way. And I think some rules fall into the category of they should definitely be followed. And other rules fall into the category of they're kind of stupid or they can be bent. It's kind of more situational. Okay.
When you say rules, you're talking very broadly speaking, right? Not just laws, but...
Correct. Laws, rules in the workplace, fashion rules, artistic rules, rules as a generality.
Yep.
I want to kind of lay the groundwork there because that matters going forward for my story. So, we were volunteering a couple weekends ago, and if you're not aware, my wife and I, we volunteer in some of the kids spaces. So with the younger kids, it's like a Sunday school type of deal. And the way that our church handles things is, like many churches, the kids have a sticker with a certain code on it to identify the parent, so that when the parent comes, we ensure that the kid is being picked up by the correct party.
The parents have a sticker with a matching code, and we have to match the codes before we get a child back.
And you have to see both of them and put them together, and then the kid can go with the parent.
We go to a relatively large church, so they have more strict procedures, I would say, than, for example, the church I grew up going to, where it's like everyone knew everyone. It was a lot more lax. Like, I know this is your kid. Here you go, kind of thing.
Sure, but I have been to even mid-sized churches, and they definitely have something like this. Yeah. There are legal reasons why something like this is in place.
The above and beyond safety of the children. Yeah.
Yeah. So, to me, when you're assessing a rule, part of the assessment is, what is the purpose of this rule? And in this case, the purpose of the rule is to protect the church, the volunteers, the parents, and the children. Mm-hmm. Okay? Because we don't want the kids going with the wrong person. We don't want the wrong person getting in trouble if they picked up the kids. We want to make sure the parents are getting the kids.
If we have someone who's, I don't know, nefariously picking up the wrong children, we kind of do want that person getting in trouble. But, yeah.
No, I mean, like, let's say, for example, that I went to pick up our kids, or the husband goes to pick up the kids, and then the wife is freaking out because she goes to pick up the kids afterwards, and she's like, where the hell are my kids?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we want to protect everyone in that situation. The volunteers, right, the church, all of these things are, it's kind of obviously not necessarily felt in every interaction, but it's kind of a tense situation, right? A lot of things could go wrong, and we have kids here.
Yeah.
Like,
you have other people's children.
You don't want to make mistakes with other people's kids
in your care.
Yeah, that's a big deal. So certain rules like that, even if a situation were to arise, like it did for me, I think that rule is a rule that should always be followed.
In principle.
Yes. In principle. And
so the context here is what happens. Sometimes parents will lose their stickers.
Or the other parent will come to pick up their kid.
Yeah, a parent won't have a sticker, or the parent loses their sticker, or whatever. So what we have to do in that instance is, like, we can't give the child to you because we need to check a sticker.
Yeah.
And so what the parent has to do is they have to go out, talk to a church staff member, and the church staff has to go into the system, reprint a sticker for them, and in order for the church staff person to do that, they need to check a photo ID to make sure that they're giving a sticker to the right person. And it's just above and beyond safety measures for the safety and protection of everyone involved.
Yeah. So we're creating essentially a direct tie between a photo ID detailed in the system associated with a child and the person picking them up. Now, there's an interim of the generated sticker code, but fundamentally, we are ID verifying
and we
on child pickup.
Sort of, because what we don't control is we don't control who comes in with the child. So, like, a grandparent could come in with the children and go into the system, check the child in, because all you need to do to check the kid in is put in, like, your phone number, and you'll have an account in the system that has your child in there. You check the child in, it prints a tag. Whoever checks the child in has that tag.
Sure. Now. So you're contending
give the tag
that
to someone else.
Yeah. So you're contending it's a verification against whomever checked in the child. That's fine, but fundamentally, it is a form of ID verification. So I encounter this situation every once in a while because inevitably parents lose tags, right? It's a hectic time for many parents. They got a lot of stuff that they're keeping track of, their kids, probably
sometimes
a stroller, all sorts of stuff.
It happens. Yeah.
It's totally fine. So I've had many instances where the parents come and they want to take their kid, but I can't let them. And in these situations, I try and be kind of apologetic, right? Hey, sorry, I can't let you take the kid actually. We're going to have to reprint the sticker, but let me get somebody else to come on over and help out with that, right? And usually the parents are totally fine with this because in the end, like, I try and express, it's really for all of our safety. We want to make sure that the kids are safe too, right? Fundamentally, I know, like, that it's your kid, but I'm protecting your kid.
Right. And I might even know that it's your kid because I remember seeing you dropping off your kid, but I can't make exceptions to these rules because it is such a big church. It's just one of those things where it's like, we need to follow this rule. And if I make an exception, I could get myself in trouble. I could get the church in trouble. Like, we're not going to make an exception to that rule.
Yeah. And, like, you can conceive of a situation where, let's say, two divorced parents, the handoff is happening at the church, and one of the parents who's going to be picking up the child gets the code, right? And then goes into the service. But then that other original parent who's not supposed to have the child anymore goes and picks up the child, and that's who dropped him off. And I think, oh, well, it's totally fine. You can conceive of a bunch of instances like that where something weird happens and we have a problem. So I make a decision ahead of time that this is a critical rule and we just follow it flat out, okay? And this last weekend, a parent came up to me and they wanted to take the kid, and they didn't have their sticker. But this situation was a little bit different because it was actually another parent who had volunteered.
She was a volunteer during that same hour.
Yeah, during the same hour in the kids' spaces.
In a different room than you were in.
Yeah, in a different room, but she's picking up her kid. And
her kid who goes into your room, but she was in a different room. Yeah.
Yeah. And she said, well, I saw you, we're volunteering together, can I just take my kid? And I said the same thing that I always do, like, I'm sorry, we can't do that. And she was particularly upset with me and vocalize some frustrations, actually. And, you and I had a discussion about it later, and you brought up an interesting point, which is she's a volunteer as well.
Yeah, I mean, she, of all people, should know the rule, right?
And
that we are not, and you are not supposed to allow exceptions to that rule. It's like, I don't care if this is my grandchild and you are my daughter coming to pick up. Like, I obviously know this is your child, but if you don't have your sticker, I'm gonna make you go reprint a sticker, because it's a principled thing in my mind.
I completely agree.
And if you're gonna start allowing exceptions, it's like, how do you, now you need to try to find a line where you determine what is and isn't acceptable, and I don't want to have to do that. It's too touchy of a situation. You're dealing with the safety of children. I would rather rigidly apply the rule with no exceptions than try to figure out a line of what I personally discern is okay and not. Some people are probably different about that, even if they shouldn't be.
And that's what I found particularly, I guess, kind of disconcerting and surprising, which is this woman who's essentially asking me to violate the rules and then is frustrated when I'm not violating the rules, is tasked with enforcing this exact same rule. So how am I to have confidence? How are we to have confidence that she would properly enforce the rule when she's looking for an exception herself, right? I don't know.
And that's what I'm saying. I think some people probably would have just given the kid, even if they're not supposed to. And obviously, in that instance, because you sent her out to a staff to get her sticker reprinted, she was then interacting with the staff. And the staff came and talked to us about this after the fact, and she kind of doubled down and agreed with us, like, yeah, we can't be allowing any exceptions. Like, obviously, we know that's her kid. We saw her at the beginning of the hour. We saw her dropping off her kid. We know who she is. We know who her kid is because we volunteer with her regularly, but still can't allow an exception to the rule.
Yeah. And, I mean, it was a less than ideal situation, obviously, but I just, thinking back on it, I remember when she had requested this. I remember this immense, maybe best characterized as social pressure that I felt. And I, as maybe you can attest, am a particularly disagreeable individual.
Oh, yes.
I am not easily influenced by the whims and opinions of somebody else. And yet
You're not swayed by peer pressure at all.
And yet in this moment, for whatever reason, I felt a lot of pressure. And
because there were other people around you, like another volunteer in your room?
Well,
other adults
just the way she was kind of bringing it up and the appeals that were made. And, there's a lot of hustle and bustle. So other parents are trying to get out as well.
It's an uncomfortable situation, for sure.
Yeah.
Like, it's an uncomfortable situation for her to put you into, where she's asking you to, like, basically violate a rule.
Yeah. And I just remember, like, feeling that there was a lot of pressure. Now, you can sit here and you can think it's, like, some trivial thing, and that's fine, whatever. But I did feel an immense social pressure to capitulate. And afterwards, I was kind of contemplating, like, well, what did my thought process look like, kind of in hindsight? And the funny thing is, I think the conclusion that I came to in the moment is, logically, this is fine. However, I still said no and put my foot down on it. And I came to the realization why, despite thinking, oh yeah, this is logical. Like, I do know that this is the kid that belongs to this woman. Despite coming to that logical conclusion, why I still put my foot down. And that's because I had made a decision ahead of time. And what I mean by that is not necessarily that I had conceived of this one particular instance, that I had thought, a fellow volunteer coming over. hypothesized that before, but instead that I had wholly devoted myself to this rule, let's say, that I had decided that this rule was something not to be violated well in advance. Like, there are a few rules in the kids' room, in the kids' spaces, that in my mind fall into the hard line category, and then there are other things that are kind of a little bit gray. So, like, one of the hard line things to me is picking up the kids and having the names and stuff. Another one is that we always have 2 adults in the room at one time.
Yeah.
And
you can't have just one adult alone in a room with a bunch of kids. Yeah. And again,
correct.
that's for the
safety of everyone.
Right. The protection
the parents,
of everyone,
the kids,
the protection
the
against
volunteers, the church,
everything.
Yep.
Yeah. It's
okay.
a legal thing.
That to me is a hard rule, to the point where, like, I don't allow the other volunteer to walk out of the room, period. Or I will too, and I'll call a staff member over or something. Like, that's a hard rule for me. However, there are other not so hard rules. Like, one of them is, after a certain age, you're not supposed to pick a kid up unless they say, yeah, I'm fine picking you up. Well, the cutoff age is like 3, and some 3-year-olds just start crying. And they're not going to be able to vocalize, like, yes, you can pick me up as I have a bloody nose. Like, if the kid has a bloody nose, I'm just going to pick the kid up and take him over and start helping him with his bloody nose.
Or sometimes a parent might be bringing a child and the child is unhappy. And
and the parent's trying to hand off the child. Like, he'll acclimate once I leave.
You grab the kid and you kind of hold them while the parent leaves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you kind of need to make a decision ahead of time, like, where exactly are those hard rules? And I think this applies to a variety of facets of life, right? Like, one of the things that comes to my mind is, like, with marriage, right? There are certain things that are hard and unshakable rules, and then there are other things that are kind of more flexible. So, like, a hard, unshakable thing is like, well, we're a monogamous couple. We're not going to get involved with other people, right? But then there are other rules that are kind of more flexible. Like, we have a budget, and we talk to each other if we're going to go and do something outside of the budget. But if I'm sitting and trying to get a birthday present for you and it's, $10 over our budgeted amount, I'm just going to kind of go along with it. Like, it's a trivial amount in general, and it's something that, like, you're not vehemently opposed to. And you could always undo it as well if you really ended up caring about it for whatever reason. I think you need to make decisions far in advance.
Yeah, because in the moment is not a good time to make decisions. In the heat of a moment.
Because you feel that pressure.
You're not in a good headspace to make a critical decision, most likely.
Mm-hmm.
But having convictions ahead of time, making those decisions ahead of time, it's kind of like, same with marriage, like making that decision ahead of time explicitly that, divorce is not an option.
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people explicitly make that decision ahead of time. Obviously no one plans to get a divorce, but I don't know that everyone plans explicitly not to.
Yeah, it's a good distinction.
And there's a difference between not planning to and planning not to.
Yeah, you used a good word there, which is, I think, people with convictions. And I think when you have that conviction and you make a decision ahead of time, right, there's this level of resolve that you have. Once you've put up those barriers. Like, oftentimes people think that barriers are constrictive, that they inhibit one's abilities. But I would contend that once you put up those walls, those guardrails, well, then you can kind of feel free to do whatever inside of them because you've instituted those protections. And I think that at least for me, is something that helps me not go along with either A, my momentary whims, or B, social pressures. And I so often see people that have just the same politically correct opinions, the same views on everything that the masses do. And I always think to myself, like, you're just wholly lacking in conviction on this. Like, there's no resolve that you ever had on this topic. You never actually made a decision and thought. You just kind of meandered with
You can always tell when people tend to be that kind of way if you ask them why they believe what they claim to believe.
Mm-hmm.
And they can't provide an answer, they can't provide a good answer, or they just repeat talking points where it's like, you didn't come up with that thought, you know? Like, you heard that and you're repeating it. You're not answering my question of, why do you believe this thing?
Yeah. I always get the impression with those people that it's like dealing with a wet rag.
What?
Like that, like there's just nothing of substance. It's just there's nothing hard to like grab onto.
Okay. Is that a phrase? I've never heard that before. A wet rag?
Yeah, you're just like a wet rag. There's just nothing to it. There's no fire. There's no spark. There's just kind of like boring complacency. There's no hard takes.
I've never heard that before. I don't really get that analogy, but okay.
Okay, one sec. I looked up wet rag under idioms of the Free Dictionary, and it reads, a very weak-willed, helpless, or cowardly person, one who lacks any real resolve, inner strength, or motivation, one who is completely worn out or without energy. That second one was the secondary definition.
I don't think I've ever heard that before.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Completely lacking in resolve.
Why is it a wet rag? Why not just... Like, what's the origin of that analogy? I don't get it.
I don't know.
Like, it's not self-evident, at least not to me. Whatever. Anyways.
I think it's just, like, it kind of flops about.
Wet rags could be really useful.
Well, yeah. Yeah, they can be manipulated.
I guess. Into whatever shape you want. But you can do that with a dry rag, too.
Not as easily, I guess. But anyway, it is a saying. It's an idiom, yeah.
I don't like it.
Okay. I do. I think it's really emblematic. It's like mildly, I don't know.
Like,
it has like this negative. It has like this mild negative connotation to it, but not like extreme vehement opposition or something.
I don't really get that. Like, wet rags are useful. I don't know.
So anyway, I feel like a lot of people without resolve, like I kind of think about them like wet rag people, you know, and for whatever reason, those types of people I really do not get along well with, because I think it really bothers me because
it's hard to talk to them about things. Like, I feel like it's hard to have meaningful conversations. Like, you're talking about people who are not very conscientious, right? Like, they're not really thinking about what they believe and why they believe what they believe.
Yeah, I think the real struggle that I have is when you have somebody who has no backbone like that. They end up being this, in my mind, like massive liability. And because of that, I struggle to be friends with them. Because if you're just pulled about by any whim,
tossed and turned by the waves, yeah,
then how am I to depend on you to be consistent? Right? I think this is something that's oftentimes discussed in like Catholicism, but something that is considered necessary to virtue is courage. Because to go against sin, whether that's coming from to go against temptation so that you don't sin, whether that temptation comes from how you yourself are feeling, from something external, or from peer pressure, it requires courage to take that on and will.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like oftentimes considered or discussed as a prerequisite to virtue. And I feel like when I see people like that who have no resolve, I think to myself, and I think that this is a reasonable thought, that's a liability. I don't know how I could trust you. Like, I would argue you can't even trust yourself. So why should somebody else trust you? I see this a lot as well in some of these, like, more establishment people who are not necessarily for anything in particular. Like, they'll say that they're for things, but they're kind of these vague notions. Like, oh yes, I'm here to promote and be for niceness and kindness and being good. Like, we're just for the good. Like Google, we'll keep it more on the corporate level because I don't want to necessarily call it a bunch of individuals, but Google's company motto at one point was, don't be evil. And I look at that and I go, like, exactly, what does that say?
What does that have to do with Google, too? That doesn't make any sense.
They're just, I don't know, they're involved in a lot of different things. And they're trying to be good for the planet instead of evil. So their saying was, like, don't be evil. But your reaction is completely reasonable. You go, that doesn't tell me anything. That's just...
That doesn't even really make sense with what the company is in my mind. But, okay. That's strange.
But
I've never heard that before.
I feel like those people or companies that lack resolve and have these vague notions of what they're attempting to achieve, these wet rag people and companies.
You calling Google a wet rag?
In their resolve? Yeah, kind of. You go with every whim of the culture, so yes.
To your credit, you do kind of refuse to use Google now.
Yeah, pretty much.
At least.
But I feel like those same people just go with the flow and adapt to whatever is accepted. And I'm not trying to be hyperbolic here, but these are the exact same people who would have done the exact same thing, go with the flow, and just adapt to whatever the accepted viewpoint in the culture is. They would have been the same people to do that in Nazi Germany or the USSR.
They're more likely to have, yes, than the kinds of people who stand up against the waves and tides of society. Yeah.
Sure, but like if you can't weather some small dissent, some trivial non-PC, not perfectly PC opinion that you have, if you can't advocate for that and speak your mind, then how are you going to do it when something real, something tangible is on the line? Right? Like if you can't stand up when the negative consequence is nothing, how are you going to stand up when the negative consequence is massive? Mm-hmm. Like going to jail. Mm-hmm. I feel like there's a real lack of courage and resolve in our culture today.
I think it's shifting a little bit. Maybe that's the optimist in me. But
certainly, I'm saying in like, in a broad
what's
sense.
the meme that's like, bad times create good men or strong men or something, mm-hmm. and then good men create good times, and then good times create weak men, and then weak men create bad times. Like this, the cycle.
The cyclical view.
So society, I feel like part of me takes an optimistic approach and saying where we've gotten as a society and as a culture, just in so much of our political and social discourse, like I feel like it's going to create like a new revival of people who are strong-headed. Or maybe strong-headed isn't the best way.
Like strong-willed?
Strong-willed and assertive.
Yeah.
Maybe more courageous.
I certainly hope so. I mean, I think we're seeing inklings of that. I hope that people make some of those decisions ahead of time. Because...
decide what they stand for before they have to stand for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, like I said, I felt an immense social pressure in even that trivial thing. Mm-hmm. The only thing that really kept me from saying, oh, yeah, no, it's fine, and just going with the flow was the fact that I had decided ahead of time.
I think it's easy to fall into sin and temptation mm-hmm. that way, too. Like, when you haven't, you know, if you have certain boundaries, like, say, in a relationship that you've mm-hmm. gotten into, that you haven't defined ahead of time where that boundary is that you're not going to cross, mm-hmm. don't wait until you're right at that boundary in the moment to decide if that's your boundary.
You have to do it preemptively.
Yeah, like,
yeah.
You know, that applies to all sorts of different kinds of sin, right? Mm-hmm. If you struggle with a certain thing, you need to decide ahead of time where your boundary is, how far will you and won't you go, because if you wait until you're tempted into it, mm-hmm. you can't trust yourself in that moment, you know?
Yeah.
It's like, don't go grocery shopping when you're hungry.
Yeah.
I learned that.
That's true.
Every week, because I continually do that every week. So actually, maybe I don't learn it. I don't know. But I think you can apply it to a lot of different kinds of sin, temptation that we might mm-hmm. struggle with throughout our lives. You know, it's important to have that grounding that is steady and not just going through the motions, the ups and downs, following along with your current desires.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, I think we've talked about this a bit before, but one of my concerns with some of, like, preempting things like that was that I thought that more controversial, resolved side of me would result in fewer friends or people not liking me in a particular way. And kind of on the flip side, I think, is now I struggle to have friends who I don't disagree with in some capacity, who don't have strong convictions and an opposition to me. You know, I'm looking for someone who actually has opinions on things, not just someone who regurgitates what it is that they've been told.
And can express it and can have a conversation about it, right? It's like, you want someone who has convictions, even if those convictions are different than some of yours, mm-hmm. at least we can talk about it. Like, you can maybe share a different perspective with me, or I can share a different perspective with you, versus the kind of people who just, they don't really have opinions on things, or they just kind of agree with whatever sounds the best in the moment. You know, it's hard to have deep, meaningful conversations with people like that sometimes.
Yeah. But I think in part most people are fundamentally attracted to that because they realize, like, if this person is willing to stand up to me, like, that says something about their character. And in the end, in the final analysis, I think that you do want someone who's going to be able to correct you or call you on your BS if you're wrong, so that, like, you don't get bit, and who would stand up to somebody else and defend you. And part of that is having that level of courage. And I know it sounds dumb to say, oh, it's also courageous to disagree. But, like, if you're not courageous enough to disagree, how are you going to be courageous enough to, like, do anything? In the end, I think we can gain courage and have a level of resolve if we make a conscientious decision ahead of time about what we would or wouldn't do in a given situation, about how we will or won't handle something. And I think it's through that we can actually find more friends and develop some of those deeper relationships and keep ourselves away from becoming kind of wet rag individuals that just go with the flow, that lack in resolve. Well, with that, it's getting late. But recently, I've been thinking a lot about something that I'd maybe call buying things for the 80%. I see people oftentimes going out and purchasing homes or vehicles or things in general that would only be used in a very niche circumstance. You see people go out and purchase massive trucks under the rationale of, well, maybe sometime I'll use it. But I think oftentimes that results in spending an excess amount of money on things that one doesn't actually need. Like taking cars, for example. If you bought a vehicle for the 80% of the time, most people wouldn't necessarily need a truck. But then that kind of begs the question, well, what do we do with that 20% of the time? What do we do with the niche circumstances? And I think in those, first off, a lot of times you can get by with something that isn't necessarily a truck in this case. But oftentimes, even if you can't, even if you do actually need that thing, necessity breeds ingenuity, and you can find other ways of doing things. So in the truck example, you could go and you could rent a vehicle from your local hardware store. Most of them nowadays have that. Or you could talk to a friend, talk to a neighbor. I think if we buy things more often for the 80%, we can save a lot of money and more fully utilize things. But that's just what I've been musing about recently. If you have any thoughts on courage or buying things for the 80%, feel free to send us an email at secondpartypodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening, and have a good night.